Madison. One of the first things that I wanted to talk about in terms of this process for you is it sounds like it was such a collaboration with Sean Baker, who's the writer and director of the film. And once he started talking to you about this role, he started really specifically writing the script towards you. But also, I heard that he would ask you a lot of questions for your input and your thoughts. And that it was kind of the first time you'd had that experience with a filmmaker that you were working with. And so what was that experience, and having someone also really looking to you for answers and just getting really comfortable with kind of putting forward your ideas as much as listening to his?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for being here.
Microphone.
Oh.
It's off.
Speak into.
Something did feel off. Okay, now I can hear myself. Well, thank you guys for being here. And yes, it's true, I've never worked with a director who wanted to have such a deep collaboration with me. It was amazing, and it did take me a little bit of time to sort of gather the confidence in myself as a creative to feel comfortable enough to share all of my ideas. And once I did, though, I'm so glad I did, because he was so welcoming to all of them, and I realized I was able to have input and share my ideas on so many different aspects of filmmaking, not just the character and her emotionality, but hair and makeup, costumes. I mean, sometimes we would be up late at night while we were shooting, like reconfiguring scenes and rewriting little things. And so to be a part of that was so, I'm just so lucky that I was able to have that experience and to create something like on a bigger scale than what I'm used to.
I'm just gonna, oh yeah, there we go. I love that you were bringing up as well the character's look, because I feel like there's so much in the aesthetic, and I imagine that it made a huge difference once you kind of physically stepped into her. You know, just like the tinsel hair strands are so specific, the nails, even just the clothing and the fabric that she wears. And so when you were kind of putting together a Pinterest board of some of the ideas and suggestions that you wanted to take to him and to discuss, what were some of the aspects of that felt really important and crucial to you in building her look?
Oh yes, I mean, that's such a fun part of creating a character, because you can do all of the emotional work, all of the, you know, I learned Russian for this film, I did all of this physical preparation, I you know, created this accent, but once you have the hair and makeup and the costume on, everything falls into place, and you walk onto set and you are this person when you're wearing her clothes, and you know, you have her hair the way that she does it. And so I love creating mood boards. I like organizing things. It's just the way that my brain works is, I just enjoy it. And so for this character, I created a couple different ones, and I shared them with Sean, and he loved them. And I also shared them with the hair and makeup team and costumes. And so you asked specifically about the makeup or hair?
Like even just like the nails and the strands of hair.
Yeah. So the hair tinsel, I had actually pinned a photo of a girl with glitter in her hair, and then our amazing hairstylist came up with the idea of putting tinsel in, which is such an amazing idea because it adds so much dimension to the hair, because my hair is so dark and black that the tinsel would catch the light and looked so beautiful on film. But it's also really interesting to think about how long it takes Annie to do her hair, because there's so much thoughtfulness involved in putting all of those strands of tinsel in. Like, it takes quite a long time, and so she's clearly being very specific and calculated about her appearance and how she wants to be perceived and how she wants to feel. And so I loved that part of her. But the nails, I wanted her to have just like a big pop of attitude on the tips of her fingers, because when you have long nails on, you start moving your hands in a different way. Like all of a sudden you're like talking you're like moving your hands when you talk, and you pick things up differently, and I had all this attitude in my fingertips, and so I went and I got my nails done, and I was like, what if I did a butterfly? And I asked Sean, and he was like, oh, that's perfect. I actually just rewrote this scene where Yvonne's father calls her a night butterfly, and which is like sort of an old-fashioned saying for like a sex worker. And I was like, wow, that's so kismet and perfect. And I remember I got them done, and Sean was a little concerned about how big the butterfly was. And he was like, maybe we could just like clip those off with like a pair of pliers. And I'm thinking, oh, I think they're really like stuck on there. But it ended up being so perfect because you can see it so clearly, and also having nails like that is just part of the culture of being a dancer and working at a club like that. Like, all of the girls have really long, beautiful, intricate nails. Yeah, and in the makeup and the costumes, even some of the costumes, I went and bought myself in Brighton Beach. Like, there's this pair of very sparkly rhinestone shoes that my character wears in the film, and I bought those at a Russian clothing store a block away from where I live, and I love them. I mean, Annie, she's very, very specific about how she wants to be perceived and how she dresses at work. There's a lot of symbolism involved in her clothing, and I could keep talking about it.
No, there's so many amazing details, and you were mentioning Brighton Beach, and you spent so much time immersing yourself in terms of the dialect, not just preparing it, but like I heard that you actually spent some time living in that specific area of Brooklyn to make sure that you could go into a coffee shop and place an order, and that people would feel like it was authentic, so you could improvise. But also that you started to kind of really find her voice kind of being like much more in your chest and sitting a little bit deeper, and I was just interested in how the dialect also ended up just informing the tone of the character's voice for you as well.
Yeah, well, I am such a California girl. Like, I was born and raised in Los Angeles. I'm sure at times it comes out more than I would like it to, like it just did. But my voice is like very much resides like up here, like all the ends of my sentences kind of go up. And I was like, no, there needs to be something a little more grounded to her voice. And so I worked with a dialect coach to kind of create the base for the accent. But I wanted it to be very specific. I didn't want it to just be like a blanketed, sort of vague New York accent. I was like, no, this needs to be very specific to Brighton Beach and Brooklyn, and I want it to be modern and sound the way that a lot of young women I met, like at clubs and just around Brighton Beach sound. And so I moved there about a little less than a month earlier before we started shooting, and I lived right next to the train, actually, and so every time the train would go by, I would like feel it, the vibration of it in my apartment, which I actually loved. And yeah, I lived like 2 blocks away from where my character lives technically, and I was able to really fine-tune the accent from there and give it lots of nuance and get to a place where I was very happy with where it was. And so a couple times, even though I was very like embarrassed doing it, I like walked into a coffee shop, and obviously like everyone tries to speak to me in Russian first, and I give them that like sort of blank American stare, like, and then I tried the accent out a couple times and nobody really blinked, and so I was like, okay, I think I'm in a good place. And I also wanted to add just a modern cadence to her vocality as well. So it was really important.
I also wanted to talk a little bit about her demeanor as a character, because I've heard you describe it as, she's always ready to jump into a fight if she needs to, physical or verbal, and she's kind of this tension-loaded spring at all times, like, with these defense mechanisms that she's had to build to survive in the world. And I love the way that the tension builds so specifically throughout this entire story. And so how did you think about just that idea of what she's holding on, and what are those trigger points, and what are those moments where she's going to kind of unleash it a little bit more when she needs it?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think she's this very scrappy woman. And I think she's, she's this very scrappy woman. And I think 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 that she's very sensitive and vulnerable on the inside, and I think that is what causes her to be so defensive at times. Because nobody is just like angry or defensive. There's always a deeper meaning underneath why. And so I was very specific as to her life and her backstory and all of her emotions and like her morals and what makes her her and all of that vulnerability, and I wanted to keep it underneath. And there's times where you get to see it peek out in more vulnerable moments, in more private moments in the film. And I always wanted an audience member to be able to see that in some way. But I think in terms of like her defensiveness, I think it's just, well, one, her job. I think you constantly have to be on your toes, you have to be protective of yourself. I mean, she's a hustler, and so she's just not gonna let anything past her. And I am so different as a person. Like embarrassingly, like I'm quite passive, I think. I avoid conflict like the plague. I'm like the first one to back down in an argument. And so I'm like, how do I get to this place where there's going to be so much improvisation implemented in this film, and she's such a firecracker. Like, I wanted to be in a place where if like someone just poked me a little bit, I was like ready to spring up and have like 10 things to say. And so I tried to just get to that place, and I think through evolving the character and her backstory and asking myself lots of questions about her, I was able to get there and sort of live in that place where she's constantly ready to pounce. But that's one of the things I like about her the most, because she is such a fighter, has such a like fighting spirit to her, and it's fun to play a character who's ready to go all in at any moment.
I love what you were describing at the beginning, though, about the vulnerability and the softness inside of her at the same time, because it feels like that's part of why the entanglement with Ivan becomes so complex. You know, at the beginning, it's business, and then it becomes those moments where we see that he disarms her, that there's a hopefulness, there is flirtation, romanticism, you know, and there's all those things that cause her to look past the red flags that usually she'd be very astute about from what we see at the beginning of the movie. And so how did that kind of like inner part of her really lead into a lot of the complexity of that dynamic as it builds for you?
Yeah, well, I've always seen Annie as a very intuitive person. I think you have to be to live the kind of life that she does. And so I think that she, at least, maybe unconsciously in some ways, recognizes the red flags, and she knows that it's not going to end the way that she dreams of it ending. But she's still hopeful, and she's fighting. She's fighting to keep the life that she feels she has earned or that she deserves. And so I think that during the course of this very short time that she meets this guy, she is seduced by this incredible life and this fairy tale ending that she's fallen in love with. I don't think that she necessarily is in love with Yvonne. I think she's in love with the idea of it. And I think that she sees love as a very near possibility for her. And that's why she fights so hard. I think she's very sure of her place in the world and who she is. It's just other people who question it. And I think that's very frustrating for her. But it also, when you're able to see that hopefulness shine through, I think you can't help but sort of root for a character like that, who is so rooted in that hopefulness, and also through that there's a lot of vulnerability, which is very interesting for me to play with as an actor.
And it's really interesting to watch her go from that place of fighting so hard to maintain this thing that, you know, she's literally got it in her hand and then it's starting to disappear. You know, he's not even there. He's run out, he's left, she doesn't know where he is. And through that course of the next day, you know, she's really trying to hold on in every way, shape, or form. But then it does reach that eventual wall of, I recognize what this is now, and I recognize that this isn't gonna end the way I hoped. And so for you, how did you want to kind of allow for that to start to seep in and for that to feel like a very different place in her, because that last act of the movie is so different emotionally in what we see in you?
Well, I mean, I think the arc of that is so important because at first, when he runs away, obviously that's a shock to her, and it's kind of like a slap in the face in some ways. But I think she still thinks that they're going to stay married when these guys come in, and she's fighting for that because she's convinced that they're wrong, and that he's going to fight for her in some way. And I think over the course of that one specific night, it starts to dawn on her that he's not going to come for her. She's going to have to find him, and she's going to have to convince him in some way. And so it's a slow progression. And I wanted to be very specific about where she's at emotionally in each scene. And so I did a lot of work trying to cultivate that specific arc, but I think the biggest moment where she realizes that it's really over, and that the last shred of hope that she had and the last shred of dignity is sort of shattered is on the steps in the scene walking into the private jet. That to me that's the scene where it's all over. And any kind of affection or love or possibility of love or hopefulness, it's totally shattered at that point.
I also wanted to ask about the two scenes where we see those physical altercations and those fights, because you did all of your own stunt work through this film, working with a stunt coordinator. You and Anora really, really go for it with each other, and it feels like you can kind of see the two of you both escalating the energy in that sequence. I heard that it was his idea for his character, for Igor to shout back at you just as loud and kind of bring it louder, which then gives you something more to play off of. But it's a very different sequence of events in the house with him than it is with the other dancer at the club, because that's more personal, that's more of an attack, whereas the other is survival and defensiveness. And so how did you want to make sure that they were playing for like very different intentions for Annie?
Well, when the men come into her house, like, first of all, she's essentially in underwear. She's never met or heard of these guys before. She doesn't know what's going to happen to her. And I think that the scene, in some ways, because of the intensity, it's quite absurd. And I think it makes people laugh because it's so shocking. Which I found people have said to me that they feel bad for laughing in that scene when the movie's over, which is very interesting. But I mean, she's fighting for her life. She doesn't know what's gonna happen to her, if she's gonna die, or so she's just fighting to get away, and they're restraining her. But then in the scene in the club where she's fighting Diamond, she instigates the physical altercation. And that's a true scrap. Like, they're trying to hurt each other. And they're like pulling hair, like they're scratching, that's like more of a cat fight, I would say. And then the other one felt more like a life or death situation, literally. But I mean, ironically, the scene in the club was 10 times more brutal to shoot. Even though it's very dark and shadowed. Oh man, I mean, the stunt coordinator, it was amazing because for that scene in the club, we had very limited time, and he was like, okay, so, you guys you can throw that punch here and then jump over this, and then you can maybe knock this table over and end up here, and then you roll over here, and maybe, you guys knock this over and you guys end up here. What do you guys think about that? We were like, okay. Yeah, I guess we'll try that. And we quite literally just fought each other. It was so intense. I twisted my ankle, I broke my entire pinky nail off. She busted her knee open. And Lindsay, who plays Diamond, was so ready to scrap with me. We looked at each other and we're like, let's go. Oh man, that was brutal. I was so exhausted. I would be literally in tears, and my legs were like jello. He would be dragging me away afterwards. It was so intense. But then the scene fighting him, it was very physically demanding, but it was so specifically choreographed that it felt different to shoot. I mean, we shot that over the course of 8 days as well, so it was spread out. And then the scene in the club we shot within like a couple hours. So.
I also wanted to ask about working with Kennedy Schneider, who was the pole dancing teacher that you worked with, because I love the fact that we really only see you for that brief moment on the pole, but you're doing incredibly advanced, complex moves that take months and months of training to attain. And what was that experience in terms of working with her and being like, this is the idea that I have for the choreography, this is the type of level that I think she needs to be at? Because like you said, she's someone who's really good at her job, takes her work very seriously, and really just conceptualizing what that scene and what that moment needed.
Yeah, Kennedy is so amazing. She's a dancer, choreographer. She's so immensely talented, kind, patient. And I met her, and I had a lot of hopes for what I wanted to be able to accomplish physically, because I wanted Annie to be a very seasoned dancer. I wanted her to seem like she's been dancing for at least a couple years, and with that, I wanted to pull off a couple impressive moves or tricks. Like, she has a lot up her sleeve, and I wanted it to be effortless and seamless. And I think I naively went into the training because I had been to clubs, and I'm watching these dancers move, and it's so sensual and effortless. And I was like, oh, like maybe I can do that. It was the most challenging thing I have ever had to do physically, and like I was going from working out every day to trying to do all of this conditioning and training, and it was so difficult. But from the beginning, I showed her certain things I wanted to accomplish and how I wanted her to dance, and she looked at me and she's like, we'll get there. And I really needed that reassurance because I didn't know, I mean, the script was evolving over time, and so what ended up in the film was smaller than what we thought it would be, but it's still just as impactful because it changes the way that I felt in my body and my sexuality. It made me more in tune with like my movements, and it gave me a physicality that I didn't have before. So all of that training was so valuable in creating the body for this character. I mean, she also taught me how to give lap dances, like how to twerk. We choreographed this this dance together, and yeah, I mean it's such an impactful part of bringing the character to life. I think even from a short scene of you seeing her dance, you learn so much about this character and who she is, what she could possibly be capable of, and a lot of her history. And so it was, yeah, working with her it was such a valuable part of the preparation process.
I mean, the amount of preparation and time and skills and research that you were diving into across the board is incredible, and you know, including in that the fact that you were learning Russian. But I was really curious about the space that you really saw that for Annie as a character, because it's not a language that she's grown up fluent in. She's more comfortable listening to it and understanding it versus speaking it. But she understands when it's important. Like when she talks to Yvonne's mother, she's like, I know that I need to address her in her language in this moment. And so how did you set about just figuring out what her scope of language would be, but also then when you're in scenes with the other actors who are speaking in Russian and Albanian, what's her level of understanding? When does she know what's going on, and when is it maybe going over her head a little bit?
Right. So Annie's grandmother, the story is that she spoke Russian and that she would only speak Russian, and so that's how Annie learned to speak Russian. And so we had decided that she would maybe have like an elementary school level of speech, because she didn't really speak it outside of just talking with her grandmother. And so whilst I was learning Russian, I needed to keep in my head a very specific level of which she spoke. I didn't want it to sound like she was fluent. I wanted there to be this sort of barrier between her and like a completely fluent Russian speaker. I never wanted her to feel like she fit in any specific group. She's an outsider in lots of different ways, and I think that when like the scenes where she's trying to connect with Yvonne and she's really trying to have some sort of deeper conversation, she's reaching out to him in his language. and her language, and he makes fun of her, you know, because she's not one of him. She never will be in so many different ways, and so that was very specific choice, and also kind of worked to my benefit as well, because it meant that I didn't have to learn how to roll my R's. I was able to keep that part of it, which was fun to work with. But yeah, people are speaking Russian and Armenian in the film, and so my character doesn't understand Armenian, so those are the parts that she doesn't know what's happening, but she understands everyone else when they're speaking. And so for me, it was important to not just memorize my lines like phonetically. I wanted to really know what I was saying. I wanted to know what the other actors were saying to me, so that there's nuance and the cadence of how I'm speaking is different every time. So I really tried to do as much possible work as I could in trying to digest as much of this language as possible, which is a very complicated language to try to learn as much as you can in just a couple months. But I would fall asleep listening to like 10 hours of Russian speaking, and my Duolingo app still annoys me every single day. They're like, you haven't been on in 300 days. I'm like, yeah, no.
Lastly, I wanted to talk about filming that final scene between Annie and Igor, because I think it's such a beautiful scene in terms of your performance and everything that we see. You know, we see her still trying to hold on to her emotions after everything that she's been through without ever getting any sleep, really. And then just this release of that vulnerability that you were talking about earlier. But it's all the moments between the two of them that have led up to him being someone that she feels comfortable enough to show that in front of, and even just the way that he pushes back and challenges her back, you know, kind of building that rapport. And I heard that it took a little while to film that scene, and there was a little bit of apprehension going into it, and kind of really figuring out what that was going to look like in the moment. I don't want to ask you to kind of give us a conclusion at the end, because I love how open-ended it is, but how did you set about just navigating all the different layers that you felt like that really needed in the moment for her?
Yeah, it was such an important scene, and I always felt the magnitude and the weight of what that scene means to the film and for Annie as a character. I really didn't want to let her down, because, or Sean down, or anybody, because the entire film, Annie has been holding everything in. There's so many emotions that have been building up. She doesn't want to let anybody see her vulnerability, anyone see her crack. And so that moment, like she's involved in this very intimate act, but she's avoiding intimacy at all costs. And so it's so complicated, and there's so much that's happening to her and in her head. I mean, to get there emotionally was difficult in some ways, because I also felt strangely that my emotions were kind of mirroring Annie's while I was filming, which was I didn't quite realize until we were done filming. But it was interesting, I think, because of the preparation that I had done and how much work I had done emotionally on her. I was just feeling all of those same things, and so we got to a point where we filmed a scene, and it just felt really right in lots of different ways. And I mean, Yura is such an incredible actor and so soulful and vulnerable, and like looking at him, it would at times in scenes, not just the last one, but like it would like scare me, like just emotionally, like it was shocking to look at someone so deep and emotional and like beautiful in that way. And so he was the perfect scene partner to have for that scene. But yeah, we tried to shoot it so many different times, like for multiple different days. Something would always go wrong, and so there was so much building up to this scene. And I was like, I feel like I just need an extra kick, like an extra to get me there. And so, I know my face is like getting hot talking about this. It's very interesting. I was like, I think I just need to like pull something else out of my, I don't know, my repertoire of like emotional things to sort of tear me up inside. And so I have this like voicemail that my dad sent me years and years ago. And I was like, okay, well maybe I'll listen to this before we shoot the scene. And so it was like Sean was in the backseat of the car, which is so funny. And then it was just me and Yura, and so Sean played the voicemail, and I was able to listen to it, and then we started the scene. And I think having that, something that's so like private to me, and have that be shown sort of like publicly in a way, was really like what I needed to get there. Because it made me feel so many different things. It was like sort of embarrassing, very private, very vulnerable, and all of us, Sean in the backseat, Yura and I, like we both felt that, I think. And so yeah, that's sort of how I got there. But that was a scene that I was so nervous about, and really wanted to like get right, which is like you can't like get something right. You either feel it or you don't. But yeah, I'm happy with that scene now, and I think it's a really interesting way to end the film. Yeah.
I agree. It's such an astounding scene, and your performance in this movie is genuinely so phenomenal, and one that I've been thinking about ever since I first saw the movie. So thank you so much for sharing all of this incredible detail.